First and foremost, I'd like to thank the organizers of this meeting. It's also very opportune, very timely, given the events of the last few days, and given the reflections which are already appearing in the papers on the Luanda meeting. More important, I think, the introduction made it very clear that we should not be bystanders as citizens of this country. One of the most depressing aspects of the last decade in Zimbabwe is that Zimbabweans tend to wait for events to happen, as if someone else out there is going to do it for you. Some of us have been very clear that if anything is going to happen positively for Zimbabwe, it will have to be Zimbabweans themselves. You'll be pleased to know that whatever SADC has been doing for the last 2 years, specifically the Livingston meeting last year, and now the Luanda meeting, these are outcomes of pressures from inside Zimbabwe. Please know that. Some of us have been working very closely with the SADC ambassadors, working very closely with Pretoria, working closely with all those that matter. And if there has been movement on the part of SADC, it's because SADC itself has been listening very closely to Zimbabweans through their embassies. So there mustn't be any suggestion that there's been some conspiracy. The embassies have been doing their work. They've been gathering information, informing their capitals. That's how it should have been, and will continue to be so. And one of the most important developments in the throughout the period of the GNU has been the growing convergence between Zimbabweans. Some weeks ago, I shared a platform with Tendai Biti at the Jameson, and he claimed that the MDC's position was one against elections until reforms were completed. He decried the condition of the country and so on and so forth. And I got up to say, as a non-partisan person, that the views he was expressing were indeed the views of most Zimbabweans. They're not MDC views. And if you go across the country like we do, speaking to a cross-section of the population as I do, across the parties as I do, there is convergence on obvious issues. That there should be peace in the country, that there should be democracy, that violence should end, that there should be a new constitution, that there should be no elections at all until all this is done, that there should be restoration of national institutions as they were, at least when we knew them, when we were in 1980, where the public service is neutral, the army is neutral, the police force is neutral, non-partisan, national in outlook. This we knew in the 80s, when I was a civil servant. There was nothing else I knew other than being non-partisan. I've also learned something, I'm much older than some of you, many of you, is that party politics are completely nonsensical. In the post-colonial situation in Africa, political parties are not the same as the parties on which they are modeled, i.e. the parties in Europe, Labour Party. They're not. These are just election machinery. Between elections, there are no parties. There's no ideology, there's no strategy, there's no organizational framework. And indeed, if there are no elections, some parties die. And that was one of the fears of the MDC. They're in a quandary. They would like to go for elections because the elections keep them alive. But they also know that they can go for elections and probably win and still lose. So they're in a dilemma. The ZANU-PF exists only because, in name, only because it has conflated the state. Not what you see as ZANU-PF is actually the state, the machinery thereof. So when you say, Chair, as you have said, that you need to occupy your own space as civic organizations, it's very appropriately said. Because many of you, less informed about national processes than most of us who are older and experienced it, tied yourselves to political parties aimlessly and blindly, to the point where you couldn't tell the difference between some of your organizations and some of the parties. That's dangerous. That should never happen again. If we've learned anything from the GNU or GPA, which I prefer to call it, is that the era of political parties is over. That we should move more and more towards convergence. And I would even go further, which point I made when I shared the platform of BT. That the era of coalition governments has come. We want coalitions to continue. And I hope those who are devising or designing the new constitution will take into account proportional representation. When we were studying political science, the British lied to us. They said the best system was the British system because first past the post, you need a government which is firm at the center of things, not distracted by other parties. And they decried what was happening in most of Europe, Denmark, Sweden, where, as you know, government has been largely through coalitions. And they work. Coalitions tend to reflect the broader spectrum of views, and therefore it integrates this broader spectrum in policy making. There is nothing wrong in coalitions. And I would say for civic society, you are safer with coalition governments than one-party state situations. The British system might be working because basically they have national institutions which have been in operation for years. But in African situations, where national institutions become secondary to the party in power, invariably, first past the post means that the ruling party is virtually a one-party state. And the opposition becomes a lame duck because the political party in power conflates itself with the state. It lives off the state's resources, and the rest you know. So I thought I'd give that as a background, that we are speaking in the context of a growing convergence among Zimbabweans for obvious things. Now, I've been asked to look at the GPA status. I did send to the organizers a copy of a paper which was published in the Independent 17th of February. It was elections or GNU 2, question mark. The Independent typically often loses the plot. They published the article, but they left out the essential part of it, which I'll deal with shortly, which was what do we mean by GNU 2? If you don't have the paper, I'll just refer to it briefly there. The point is this: the GPA or GNU is an outcome of failed elections. The failed elections were a result of failed constitutional order. The constitutional order was a failure as an outcome of failed politics since about 1990. The main of which were the following. One, conflation of party and state. Two, the resultant decline of national institutions, and even including the abrogation of the constitutional provisions under which national institutions operate. This is important. I want to illustrate this, because many of you, and I sit in the GPA provisions, they talk about security sector reforms. I don't know what that means, to be honest. What I know is that if you observe even the existing constitution and the provisions under which the security forces, the public service operate, it's very clear. In my time, 1980 to 1990, if a civil servant spoke out of turn, published, he or she was fired. We went through 3 army commanders who retired in terms of the provisions of the Constitution. Several police commissioners who also retired under the provisions of the Constitution. It was unheard of that a civil servant would flaunt party t-shirts, as I've seen in the last 20 years. It was impossible. I would even tell you what was used to fire me in 1990. We used to have an annual review of politics in the region in every December. In 1989, I was one of the speakers at Park Lane Hotel, and I was speaking on the one-party state. You may have seen our book, which was published later. And I was asked by someone from the floor, what do I think of the one-party state? And I said, it's out of touch with reality. The next morning, Fingas, under Trevor Ngube at that time, published the one-party state out of touch with reality, says Mandaza. And it was during the party congress of 1989. I got phone calls from colleagues from the congress saying, well, we are really in trouble. You're a civil servant. Even though I was talking at an academic conference, that was used. And a few months later, I was retired prematurely. But such were the national institutions. And now you see all kinds of people speaking out of turn as civil servants, as army officers, and nothing happens. I was on Defense Forces Commission for 6 years, and we did our work. There was never any problem. But now, such confusion. So what I'm saying basically, when you talk about security sector reforms, what you are actually asking for is to return to constitutionality. That's all. And that doesn't require even just needs leadership. In other words, it has become expedient for the current state and those that govern it, especially leadership, President Mugabe's leadership, to disregard the constitutional rules under which the national institutions operate. It's expedient, convenient, but it's also dangerous. And that's why we, as citizens of this country, must ensure that in the context of this GNU, and before the GNU ends and before elections, that we restore these national institutions. Because our fear, some of us, is that the MDC, if they came to power, they'd be quite happy to continue with this rot. Certainly, one of the most depressing things about the MDC as a party of reform is that they've not come up with a determined and resolute program of reform. Why do you have to wait 3 years? Why you are quite a number in Parliament? Why can't you stand up and say, look, these are the reforms that we require? Whether these coincide with constitutional provisions as we're discussing or not. But simply, even the thing I'm raising now, restoring national institutions, what you need some fantastic security sector reforms to is simply to insist that from day one, from today, it is Parliament's duty to ensure that national institutions are observed for what they are. And that those who fail to live up to those constitutional provisions must retire, or resign, or be fired. Simple as that. So, it appears to me, our political elite, whether MDC or ZANU-PF, seem to thrive on this untidiness that we have had for some years. And the danger is that really a new dispensation comes to being without these reforms, we'll be in trouble. And it is naive